Great Battles, Great Leaders series. I'm afraid it's time to talk turkey here, in the sense that for almost anyone out there, I think that's what these games would qualify as. Here's the problem. Richard Berg, the designer, accumulates a lot of criticism sometimes for games that are too fiddly, too detailed, rule sets that are ambiguous, possibly contradictory at times, feeling that maybe he produces unfinished games. Well, these are exemplary of all those criticisms, and they really are. Now, it just shows you how lousy my taste must be, because I had a fun time with at least 2.5 of them. So here's the first problem. This is A Famous Victory was not ready for publication. There were counters in reasonable quantity. There were rules issues. There was a particularly obnoxious combination of using D6s and D10s for different things for no real good reason. Much of that got cleared up in Fields of Glory. However, there are still a lot of problems with this. There are still some ambiguities, still places where at least I felt like, geez, I'm not entirely sure what the designer means in this case. Now, maybe you can find question and answer threads over on Consim World that'll answer it. That's fine, you know, I mean, whatever floats your boat. For me, my boat sails when I'm making these rules up on my own, and that works. And so I tinker with it, I see something, I say, geez, I don't like that. And I get rid of it, or I change it. I find that I'm playing something in contradiction to the rules. Well, maybe I try a little bit by what the rules seem to say. And I'm okay with that, and actually, to some extent, that may add to some of my enjoyment of a game. But you have to already love Richard Berg's designs and some of the flaws that come with them. And we'll go into more detail about the actual gameplay issues, at least to the extent that I was able to discern what the rules intended was. Beyond that, though, beyond just loving, say, lots of stuff that Berg does, you also have to have a real interest in this period, a real desire to play tactical games in the Age of Marlborough. Marlborough's four big battles. I don't know if you can call them Applicata victory. But if those two things apply, you might be okay. Just make sure you get this one. If you're going to get this one, get them both. Because without the Fields of Glory rules and charts, you've just got a really inferior product that, you know, I mean, I switched rules halfway through the first game of A Famous Victory. So, components-wise, they actually are fairly different. Only A Famous Victory comes with the wonderful cassette, which I cannot review at all. I haven't listened to it. I really wish I had, but I can't bring myself to do that. The counters, for me, these are a big, big problem. First of all, in A Famous Victory, there was a lot of counter misprint issues. Like, I don't know, by a lot, maybe a dozen. Fields of Glory has a couple. Neither one's a terrible deal, except I don't know if it's just that my eyes are going bad, because that seems, I would guess that's more the case than anything else. But the unit designations were very difficult for me to read, and it's absolutely imperative that you figure out exactly what units what. In a lot of ways, I think the game would have done better by eliminating unit designations, since there's a lot of dispute and question about the OOB. I mean, Berg brings this up himself, and I've seen at least one reviewer or one comment going into the OOB is basically just a pure fabrication. Now, he probably has some sources and says, wow, this doesn't match my sources. I'm guessing Berg probably put a little bit of effort into getting the sources right. But on the other hand, this the person who left the comment, I feel, probably is a minis gamer of the era. And has a definite interest in it, and has probably done at least some significant research. So basically what you're saying is, okay, like a lot of these earlier war games, earlier in terms of the era that they represent, you're kind of getting a crapshoot as to how realistic your OOB is, how realistic the deployment is. In fact, a famous victories scenarios all go with set up your own scenario, because set up your pieces yourself, because basically there's so much contradiction in terms of what the reports give, and most of them are just really, really sparse anyway. So you're not going to get any kind of definitive setup by the designer. Now, I wish there had been more effort made towards here's what we think the setup would look like. For one thing, it would help in terms of here's a reasonable setup. Here's how we think units deployed during that era. So doing this one first, doing a famous victory first, left me in more chaos than perhaps had I, say, played the battles from Fields of Glory first. Okay. You also have these kind of weird reduced markers, which look like there's some sort of strength point reduction, and they're not. They kind of fixed that issue. They fixed a lot of the intuitive the things that were really counterintuitive in a famous victory over in Fields of Glory. So they did these little bracketed things that are more clearly that you're taking a step loss rather than any effect, because there is no effect to casualties in the game, except eventually, well, whatever they mean to represent. They may be cohesion or whatever. There's no effect to them except after you take a third one, your unit's destroyed. So you always have the same firepower, etc. That seems a little unbelievable, and in fact there are actually a lot of rules in the game and a lot of factors that feel to me like they don't quite work well. One of the biggies, I'm supposed to be doing components here, right? One of the biggies is the whole pulsed actions, okay? So you see this in Men of Iron 2. Here you're using a chit pull type system, but not all the commands get to go. Okay. I like the concept of that. It's this idea of, I'm just eating my foot. It's not always, it's not always the case on the battlefield that everybody's busy doing everything or something. In fact, the big flaw with TSS is everything's busy doing something. Therefore, the players can push their units to levels where commanders simply wouldn't. You have no breakdown in the chain of command or anything like that. You just move your pieces where you want them. And then the technical details of how well the weaponry works, which is pretty well established for American Civil War, ends up giving you ridiculously inflated casualty levels. And you're just like, nah. To tell you the truth, even though the Civil War Brigade series introduces a lot of command uncertainty, it still also feels a little inflated, but it goes a long way to fixing it. This kind of system, and my understanding is that Berg's third incarnation of Great Battles of the American Civil War actually takes that into account. Not by fudging the values of the weaponry, which is something Mark Herman tried with Stonewall, and I think ends up feeling very wrong because of that. Even though you might get more accurate casualty levels overall. Losing a train somewhere. Anyway, this chit pull system, basically you have a number of chits that you're going to be able to throw in the cup each turn. And that's kind of randomly determined. And then you select your most important, to do something leaders, and you put them in. And what that means is, if you really want something done, something will happen there. The problem is that units get into close range where they're firing at each other, and then it may not behoove either player to activate the units there for combat. And they just end up sitting there for hours, I don't know, maybe withdrawn a little bit. You can kind of do some hand waving and explain that part of it, except that there are other aspects. For example, you generate withdrawal fire when you leave a hex. So only by retreating from the hex do you end up, causing the enemy. Somehow you cause the enemy to run right up towards you and start shooting or something. I have no idea what it's supposed to represent. Probably nothing. It's probably just a flaw in the system. And I found a lot of different aspects of this system similarly unbelievable. I also found some other issues. For example, squares. Okay, squares were very rarely used, I find out, in this era. However, the armies were trained in them, and occasionally squares were committed. In fact, Blenheim had squares occur. The rules do not add squares. I'm not sure they absolutely need to, because cavalry is pretty damn ineffective against the infantry in this game. Maybe too ineffective. I've seen some places in the game where they end up managing what seemed like historical results in terms of plowing in, but I think I was cheating when that was happening. As I got more familiar with the rules, and most importantly, some of those rules changed between A Famous Victory and Fields of Glory, so that may have also had an effect. I began to see more and more that Cav was just fucking pointless. You really would rather have lots of infantry. Yeah, Cav could be fast, and yes, it's great at running down routers and such not, but it just didn't have, I don't want to say the shock impact, because that would imply something. The Cav wasn't used as a heavy shock factor, but it did tend, especially the English Cav, which was used heavily for shock, it did have a tendency to be able to turn battles, to get into this key location. I found these battlefields usually too cramped for the amount of troops on them for these big Cav maneuvers to be able to break up the battlefield. Anyway, let's get back to the components. The map, for the first one, it's serviceable, somewhat uninspired looking. A little bit amateurish. Kind of reminds me of TSR's offerings of the period when they had the S&P magazines. The second one is prettier. There's no question to that, but it still isn't anything to really write home about. The woods definitely help there. This one doesn't have as much woods in it, but the greener tones I find a little bit more pleasing, but it still feels very amateurish. These little towns. It reminds me of playing minis with, kind of poorly built terrain or something. Okay, I shouldn't grump. I play the gamers, some of their Civil War stuff is pretty damn hideous, and these actually are less glaring in their hideousness. It comes with some nice player aid cards and such not. A couple of them for each. Now they had to be redone between the two games, so you end up just using the Fields of Glory ones, because if you don't, you end up stuck rolling two different kinds of dice for different kinds of things. Speaking of rolling dice, there are very few games that require the amount of die rolling that this does. It's got this strange mechanism, and here's one of those, I don't know if I'm getting it right, situations. It's got this strange mechanism on the rallying. Players can rally their units by expending an activation of a leader. It doesn't even have to be one where the chit was in the cup. Now this changes between the two games. In the first one you can rally everything, and that provides a great incentive for lots of rallying. In the second one, and also a lot of protection for your units not disappearing. In the second one, there's a strong inhibitor on the rallying. You're only allowed to rally up to your command rating. That makes it a lot less attractive to do rallying operations, so you end up kind of, alright, I'll take my chances. Because after you get to activate all units that are in command, then you get to activate out of command units. Now, if something is not in a defined command, and the rules on how you actually define the command, and whether or not you can leave units out so that you can move them in the out of command phase for some weird reason or whatever, that's all up to interpretation, along with lots of other things in this game. But anyhow, you get to roll for every single disordered or routed unit on the board. Now, units become disordered pretty quickly. Pretty much when they engage in combat. There's another one. We'll talk about the die rolls some more when we get to combat. But pretty much whenever you engage in combat, you're going to be rolling, you're going to end up disordered. Good quality troops are less likely to do so. Troops behind a defensive line or whatever, less likely to do so. But in general, your forces become disordered pretty quickly. As long as they're out of a zone of control, whether or not anybody's firing at them, and they're out of command, this is my interpretation, it's not absolutely clear in the rule, you're allowed to roll for them against their morale, and you have a chance of rallying. No auto routes on this. You could route, but if your result is bad enough. Then immediately after that, there's a rally phase where all units, whether they're in command or not, get a chance to rally. Now this equalizes to some extent the in-command player's option to rally a couple of units and the out-of-command's unit inability to be rallied that way. In a famous victory. Once you get to the Fields of Glory rules, though, it feels like the out-of-command units are getting more rally chances than in-command units do. And that feels a little odd, to tell you the truth. But there are a lot of things that feel a little odd. It doesn't feel, to me, a famous victory feels like it was completely lacking in the playtesting effort. I mean, obviously someone did some playtesting, but very little good effect seems to have come from it. And then Fields of Glory feels like players who tried a famous victory and kind of did playtesting after purchasing the finishing product, a terrible blight on the hobby, turned around and came up with a lot of neat suggestions, but those suggestions, once integrated, still don't quite play right together. It may be that the intention was to drop that out of command rally phase. That would make sense. It would make a lot of sense. In fact, the rules seem to get rid of some references to it. or maybe never made references to it in some places. I seem to remember I had the same kind of question on A Famous Victory. But when you get around to the sequence of play, both in the rule book and in the player aid card, and when you look at some other indicators within the rules, it seems like it was intended to stay that way. And it just means that you're rolling dice a whole lot. Now, rallying a unit this way is not safe, so it doesn't necessarily mean anything good's going to come out of it. You basically have assuming no modifiers, a 60% chance of rallying, but it's usually more like 40 or 50, one level, from routed to disordered or from disordered to fine. But you also have a chance of injuring any unit that tries to rally, or a chance of just routing it further and injuring it. And when those things, those things seem to happen enough that when I played A Famous Victory, my feeling was, oh, I never want to roll for rallies, assuming it's optional, which also is unclear. I never want to roll for rallies. What I want to do is I want to kind of hold off until I rally the whole thing with my commander. Well, that's gone in Fields of Glory, but still, you end in Fields of Glory, or if you play that you must rally everything in the rally phase at least, which may or may not be the case, you end up rolling a whole lot of dice. You also roll a lot of dice in combat. So when you move into an assault position, as it were, next to the opponent, basically you're going to have 2 rounds of fire combat between those units, and then another possible round of shock combat. Now, if units are already near each other, they only get 1 round of fire combat and a possible but less valuable shock for the attacker, shock combat. This does not seem to match any kind of reality, right? So I'm taking some time to get to you. Yet I get to fire twice, and my opponent gets to fire twice. But if we were just sitting there firing at each other continuously, we only get 1 shot. Now, to be fair, the approach fire is on a lesser column. But it doesn't make sense. To me, it would make sense if you did the approach fire on the turn that you approached, and that's it. Or, if you're going to do these 2 rounds of combat, no matter what, on the approach fire, also have 2 rounds of combat on the normal fire. That's not how it's written, though. And it's pretty clearly not written that way. So you end up with less intense fire after units get into contact. Now, you could, again, do some hand-waving here and say, well, combat just inherently disorders units, even if they're not marked as disordered, and the fire is going to be less regular. Okay, maybe. I hope you have something to back that up, though, because it goes against my intuition. And unfortunately, although there are designer's notes, they don't really go too much into why the particular mechanics and system were devised the way they are. So I'm left with, okay, this is a fairly detailed game. It's not tremendous. It's on the same level as those Great Battles of History games or whatever. But there are certainly some abstractions taking place, and to some extent it feels almost like a mishmash of things that you can't be sure that you're A, playing right, and B, even whether or not you're playing right, if they're really making any sense to you. On the other hand, when you fight out the battle, pretty much no matter what you do, it turns out looking kind of reasonable, Units are slamming into each other and routing and this, that, and the other. So there's some illusion that can be maintained, and I had a good time playing. And I will probably play it again a couple more times in my lifespan, especially if I stop buying so many damn games. The one thing I can say is these are probably the best tactical games on the period, just because there ain't anything else. There may be some very simplistic Napoleon at Waterloo style games out there that really don't try to show you much. Just as Breitenfeld and the 30 Years' War quad existed, I don't think that there's a... This is the perfect quad, right? I don't think there's a War of Spanish Succession quad, though. But it would have been outstanding. And so you don't have a lot of options for this period unless you want to go to minis. And there's certainly great minis options, but you know, building up the armies that you could fight Malplaquet with, that's a pretty heavy commitment. These are almost battles that beg to have been done as board war games. And they are. Simply because there are so few field battles of any importance in the in the Dutch front and German front. This is it. It's 4 battles over many years. So and there's some small battles, but these are the big ones. And then there's some battles in Spain and some battles in Italy as well. So this is pretty much your only hope if you want to play in this era with any level of detail. Whether or not you're willing to put up with what these games are like, and I would say they're pretty damn questionable on a number of different levels. Playability, rules coherence, historical believability. There's just so many little things that feel like they don't quite make sense, you know? And you have to watch my playthrough to see my struggling through the whole litany of them. I'm not going to try to remember them here. But there is a lot negative to say about these. Still, if you do happen to be used to Berg's style of games and have kind of learned to put up with his sort of worst case scenarios in terms of rules and design flaws, and really like this era, yeah, you want these, you know. But otherwise, you probably want to sit around and hope someday somebody, you know, a Ben Hull of the Spanish Succession War and the era around there, this sort of comes along and says, look, this is how these really operate, and really nails it down. Somebody who's strongly studied the era. Maybe the best bet is somebody who goes and converts some good minis rules, although the only minis rules that I've seen cover this era, and I'm sure, you know, I mean, my knowledge of minis rules is very sparse indeed, is War in the Age of Reason, which translates 7 Years' War rules over to the Age of Marlborough. I don't know if they make changes like, you know, to the value, to the types of units, etc. Because 7 Years' War Cav is more effective. 7 Years' War Artillery is more effective. The linear formations are more precise. There's a lot that's different, but you're beginning, here you're seeing the period of transition between 30 Years' War and that sort of real Age of Reason era. I categorize these as Age of Reason because I don't know what else to do. I have so few games on the pre-7 Years' War, well, the Bavarian Potato War and all that I'd count in there too, because you really have strong linear formations there too. Anyway, but everything's always changing. You know, the Little War comes into its own only in the 7 Years' War. It didn't exist in the Austrian succession to anywhere near the same degree. Anyhow, yeah, this is not something that I would recommend to anyone, but I could see other people, I mean, watch the playthroughs, watch the introduction, think real hard before you go ahead with this. It fills a slot, though, that I really needed filled, as far as I'm concerned. And it also leads me to wonder, gee, maybe I can enjoy the Battles of the Age of Reason system, because that had a lot of die rolling in it too. Yeah, it's funny, Berg, in all his reviews, would always discuss the wristage, the amount of die rolling you have to do for a game, as though it were a negative thing. And then he designed something like this. But yeah, these pulsed systems lead to some questionable circumstances. And, I almost feel like I could tinker with this game without knowing a whole hell of a lot about the era. It's an era I'm very interested in, but I don't know much about it. That's like everything, really. And come up with something that maybe was better. For example, units that are engaged already, when their no limb phase comes up, or when their out of command phase comes up, they do fire combat anyway. That would give you a reason to break the brigade and get out of there. Otherwise, and that's another special little role, you can withdraw from combat if you're under normal command. If you're not under normal command, and this is weird because you get kind of half ability when you're not under normal command, but you're in command, but not if you're out of command. You only get 1 hex movement, which may be faster than half your movement ability. If you're not in normal command, i.e. if your chit's not drawn or you don't roll a very unlikely, maybe about 30% attempt to activate a command, you can't withdraw from combat. Fair enough, But you shouldn't just be standing there looking at each other. Again, the hex size, and I go over this in the playthroughs, the hex size is such that that the units could be sitting next to each other but not in firing range. Fair enough. But who withdrew them? And how come I can't keep withdrawing then? How come I've got to take withdrawal fire if I get out of there? And get to deal some out myself, too. Just so many little questions that come up in this series. I feel like, yeah, if and when I break this out again, and I think it is a when, I'm going to be tinkering with it and changing the rules and playing a different game. Not the one that's been designed, because I just don't find this thing believable, even if the results feel okay on a broader scale. It's like all this detail put in gives you more specific story, but that specific story grates on me because it's so unbelievable that I'm pretty sure that the game is resilient enough that my little tweaks and design changes aren't going to change the nature of the battles. Anyway, that's all I have to say on these. We're going to do something lighter next.